My husband bet his friend I'd crumble when served divorce papers at Christmas dinner, unaware I was in the hallway holding more than just drinks. He thought he was delivering a grand finale, but I was about to turn his arrogant wager into his ruin. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. My husband's best friend bet him I would cry when they served me divorce papers at Christmas dinner. Men like Brandon think women are as predictable as the weather, but they forget that even the quietest sky can hold a hurricane. I stood in the hallway, my feet frozen against the cold hardwood, while my pulse roared like a freight train in my ears. I was holding a tray of drinks, the glass sweating against my palms, when I heard the laughter. It was light, smug, and carried the sharp scent of expensive whiskey and casual cruelty. Brandon's voice followed, cutting through the festive music like a blade dipped in honey. He told Nate that I would crumble, because women always do. That was 5 days before Christmas. In that moment, the woman who used to worry about the centerpiece and the perfect roast turkey died. The woman who replaced her was cold, calculating, and finally ready to stop pretending. The unraveling of my marriage didn't actually start with those papers. It started with laughter. It was always laughter. Brandon had this habit of turning my life into a punchline at dinner parties. He would lean back, eyes twinkling with a fake kind of affection, and rub my shoulder while telling our friends that he could leave me tomorrow. Everyone would chuckle, thinking it was just his edgy sense of humor. I would smile back because I had learned that smiling was the only way to survive the social glare. But inside, something was shriveling. I felt a knot tightening behind my ribs, a physical manifestation of every tiny cut he made to my dignity. People didn't see the weight of those words. They didn't notice how I stopped wearing my favorite red dress after he scoffed and asked if I was trying too hard. The world I lived in had become smaller and smaller, centered entirely around Brandon's moods and his thresholds for irritation. I started checking my tone before I spoke in public, praying my sentences wouldn't shift into a monologue about my own flaws. He never shouted. Brandon was much smarter than that. He used words as surgical tools to remove my confidence bit by bit. He would remind me how lucky I was that he was still around, asking me what I would even do without him. When my childhood best friend Jenny caught one of his remarks at a barbecue, she told me I looked like I was disappearing. I tried to defend him, calling him sarcastic, but the truth was that I was vanishing into the shadows of the man I had promised to love forever. Everything changed at a company gala a few months back. Brandon was 2 glasses of champagne into the night when he looked at me with pure contempt. He told me I was just like the rest of them, always clinging and needy. My mouth went dry, and that familiar flush of shame crept up my neck. I didn't ask what triggered it, because I rarely did anymore. When we got home, he slammed the door and went straight for the liquor cabinet. I followed him with measured steps, poured him another drink, and handed it to him with a smile I had practiced to perfection. I suggested gently that we should sign something just in case, since he always joked about leaving. I asked him why not make it official. He laughed a deep, careless laugh that echoed in our empty kitchen. He asked if I really thought he needed a prenup to protect his fantasy football winnings. Then, with a flourish of drunken arrogance, he grabbed a napkin and scribbled his name. He told me to go get it notarized if I was that scared. He passed out on the couch minutes later, the napkin fluttering to the floor. He forgot about it by morning, but I didn't. I had it notarized within 24 hours. Jenny helped me. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at me with quiet understanding and handed me a pen. I folded that document and slid it into a fireproof envelope, storing it in the back of a filing cabinet beneath a folder labeled Tax Receipts 2020. I even emailed a scanned copy to a private account Jenny set up for me. For the next few weeks, I became a shadow. I was polite, polished, and I watched everything. I started keeping a journal, not the pretty kind, but a plain spiral notebook tucked beneath my side of the mattress. I logged his comments, his moods, and the exact time he came home reeking of perfume and tequila. I wasn't planning anything consciously yet, but the fire was starting to burn. At his company's New Year kickoff party, he told a crowd of new hires that my only hobby was overspending. I didn't cry. I excused myself to the restroom, looked at my reflection, and realized he thought I was soft and breakable. He wasn't wrong. I had been. But I was learning that when you hand someone a knife, you don't get to act surprised when they learn how to wield it. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found a receipt in his jeans for 2 wine glasses, an expensive hotel room, and strawberries from room service. It was dated Valentine's Day, a day he claimed he was out of town for work. I didn't confront him. I scanned it, stored it, and logged it. It became a private ritual of evidence over emotion. At dinner that evening, he told me that if we ever split, I'd be crawling back because I couldn't even fix the Wi-Fi without him. I nodded, poured him another glass of wine, and agreed. I no longer believed a word of it. The silence in our house was growing, and it wasn't peaceful. It was tight, like a thread pulled through too many stitches, just waiting for the right moment to snap. I woke up one night from a nightmare where his voice was echoing that I would have nothing. I sat up sweating, my heart pounding, but then I remembered the document and the timelines. I had time, and I had a plan. From that point on, I wasn't his wife. I was a spy in my own home. I watched him laugh at the TV, his beer and socks tossed haphazardly on the floor, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard calculation. I told him dinner was almost ready, and he just grunted. He thought I was softening, that the fire in me had finally burned out. What he didn't see was that I was sharpening every single edge of my resolve. I stood in Jenny's office a few days later under the buzzing fluorescent lights. She stared at the napkin Brandon had signed. She asked if he really did it willingly, and I just nodded. Jenny leaned back, her leather chair groaning, and told me the document was elegant. She said he had given me the knife, and I was just deciding when to use it. I told her I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to feel safe. She promised I would, but insisted we reinforce the document. We drafted an addendum to ensure that if Brandon ever tried to twist the narrative, he would be trapped by his own arrogance. We included provisions for spousal protections and financial splits that he would never think to contest. That night, I returned home and played the role of the perfect wife better than I ever had. I became the woman he bragged about, polished, pleasant, and poised. I kissed his cheek and toasted his promotion, even though I knew he only got the job because his supervisor wanted him out of the department. I complimented his taste in wine and his new aftershave, even though it smelled nothing like the one he used when we first met. Brandon began to relax, his behavior growing more entitled and careless. He started leaving his phone face up on the counter, and I saw a message from a woman named M. It said, "Tonight, same hotel." He left for the gym 10 minutes later. I synced his phone data to my cloud folder and forwarded the screenshots. I didn't flinch. I just went to the kitchen and made lasagna, his favorite. The tension in the house was a living thing, coiling around the furniture like a snake. At a barbecue a few weeks later, I cornered Brandon's best friend Nate near the grill. He was sloshing beer and telling Brandon that I would fall apart if he ever left me. They laughed about how dependent I was. I was standing just a few feet away, arranging a fruit tray. I placed the strawberries in a perfect red spiral, one slice at a time. I didn't flinch when Brandon wrapped his arm around my waist and kissed my cheek, pretending he hadn't disappeared the night before. I just smiled and called him sweetheart. The next day, I started recording phone calls. I captured the quiet conversations where he slipped up and said too much, labeling every file by date. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, but I was building a parachute. When you live in a house made of cracks, you don't wait for it to collapse. You learn where to jump. I bought a planner and marked the days with tiny symbols: an X for late returns, a star for suspicious charges, and a dot for lies I could prove. To anyone else, it looked like grocery lists and meal plans, but to me, it was a map to my freedom. I became a mirror, showing Brandon only what he wanted to see: a woman who had stopped resisting and shrunk herself to fit into the narrow space he carved for her. He got bold, leaving large cash withdrawals out in the open and going on business trips with luggage full of cologne he never used for work calls. 2 weeks before Christmas, the final confirmation arrived. Brandon had a few drinks and fell asleep on the couch with his phone unlocked. A message thread flickered to life from M. It said I didn't suspect a thing and that he would file for divorce on Christmas. He even asked her if she wanted front row seats, attaching a laughing emoji and a gif of a woman sobbing. My fingers didn't tremble as I read it. I screenshot the message, emailed it to my private account, and deleted it from his phone. That night, as I lay beside him, I didn't see my husband. I saw a man planning my downfall like a party trick. He thought I would break, but I had already chosen my witnesses and my setting. The Christmas table was curated to look like a magazine spread, curated with a false, flickering warmth. Candles glowed in glass holders, and the roast turkey glistened under Brandon's carving knife. He looked like the proud patriarch in the maroon sweater I had bought him the year before. My sister Beth was there, her cheeks flushed from spiced wine, and Brandon's parents were chatting about retirement. Everyone looked so content and so unaware. I moved among them like a hostess on autopilot, smiling with my teeth but not my eyes. Beneath my dress, my legs were trembling with anticipation. Brandon caught my eye and winked, looking overconfident and self-satisfied. I matched his smile with a warm, unreadable one of my own. As the plates emptied and the wine settled in, Nate whispered something in Brandon's ear. Brandon stood up and tapped his glass with a butter knife, announcing he had a gift for his lovely wife. Beth smiled, expecting jewelry, but Brandon reached into his blazer and pulled out a plain white envelope. He placed it in front of me with the smugness of a man delivering a grand finale. Nate chuckled quietly as the table went hushed. I opened the envelope calmly and scanned the first line: Petition for dissolution of marriage. It was already signed and filed. Brandon had even highlighted a section at the bottom, like a schoolboy showing off his work. I looked up at him, saw his wide, expectant smile, and I smiled back. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a sleek silver pen, and signed the papers in one elegant stroke. I dated it, capped the pen, and handed them back. Brandon blinked, caught off guard by my lack of tears. He asked if that was it, his voice sounding too casual. I echoed him, and then reached under the table to lift a gold-wrapped box. I placed it right between his plate and his ego. He hesitated before tearing at the wrapping, revealing a leather folder. As he read the first line, the color drained from his face. His lips moved silently as he realized he was looking at the notarized prenup he had signed on a napkin nearly a year ago. Nate asked what it was, but Brandon couldn't answer. I explained it for him. I told the table it was the agreement Brandon signed, which had been updated and reinforced. Brandon tried to argue that he filed first, as if that changed the reality of the document. I replied with a calm smile, telling him that every asset and every clause belonged to me because he gave them to me. The room felt like it was tilting for him, the weight of everything he thought he controlled now pressing down like a stone. He finally whispered that I had planned this. I met his eyes, steady and cold, and told him that he was the one who bet I'd cry. I told him I hadn't planned anything. I had prepared. The silence that followed was thick and dense. I took a sip of my wine, the taste of cinnamon clinging to my lips. Brandon's mother looked ashen, and Beth reached for my hand beneath the table in quiet solidarity. Nate tried to speak, but just shook his head and looked away. Brandon stared at the prenup, as if he could rewrite it with sheer will, but he couldn't. I stood up slowly and began clearing the dessert plates, my hands perfectly still. I asked the table if they wanted apple or pecan pie, but no one answered. Brandon sat frozen in the wreckage of his own illusion, and I realized I wasn't broken. I was just getting started. Brandon sat with his shoulders stiff and his mouth slightly open, looking at the parchment as if it were an ancient curse. The only sounds in the room were the crackle of the fireplace and the slow clink of a spoon from the kitchen. Even the ornaments on the tree seemed to stop shimmering. His eyes dropped to the sonogram photo I had placed on the table next. He looked at it like it might vanish if he blinked. I told him I was 8 weeks pregnant. His expression cracked, a fleeting, involuntary smile withering the moment his ego caught up to the reality of the situation. The room was a vacuum of shock. He told me I didn't have to do this, his voice cracking. I replied that I wasn't doing anything. He already had. His mother was hunched forward, her pearls trembling with every shallow breath. His father was cleaning his glasses over and over, even though they weren't smudged. Nate, the man who had been so smug moments ago, was scratching his neck as the weight of his own cruelty collapsed on him. My cousin Rachel stared at me, with her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. I scanned their faces, taking in the disbelief and the shame. Their silence was the standing ovation I never had to ask for. Brandon leaned back and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he used whenever he realized he had lost control. He looked around as if someone might save him. I told him he thought I would beg and fall apart, and I admitted he was half right, until that day. I saw real fear slip into his eyes, not a tantrum, but the realization of actual consequences. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, his phone buzzed against the table. It was an email from Jenny. Subject line, prenup confirmation, legally binding. I watched his face twist in horror as he read the words, each sentence tearing a layer off his bravado. Jenny had attached backup copies with metadata timestamps. Brandon muttered for me to tell her it didn't count, gripping the phone until his knuckles were white. Then his father's phone buzzed. It was a forwarded copy of the signed documents. The man Brandon called a legal dinosaur now had proof that his son had handed over everything on a silver platter. Brandon lowered his phone like it had burned him. I turned to Beth and asked her to pass the pie, my voice almost cheerful. She recovered quickly and asked which one I wanted. I chose apple with whipped cream and stepped away to get a clean plate. Brandon's eyes followed me as I sat back down beside my sister. I told him simply that I would have the locks changed tomorrow. He looked like he'd been struck. I picked up my fork, took a bite of the buttery crust, and smiled. It wasn't to provoke him. It was because the peace tasted better than any revenge. Brandon pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood. He told me I thought I'd won, but I didn't respond. He didn't deserve a reply. He stormed out of the room, leaving the prenup, the sonogram, and his pride on the table. For a few seconds, the room stayed silent. Then Beth exhaled and muttered that she always hated that maroon sweater. Laughter flickered through the room, soft at first, then growing. Even Brandon's mother chuckled faintly into her napkin. I leaned into Beth, and she rested her head on my shoulder. There were no fireworks or broken dishes, just a quiet unraveling of power. That night, I reclaimed the dynamic of my life. Beth stayed over, promising I wouldn't wake up alone. We slept in the guest room, my hand resting on the gentle rise of my belly. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath for the last few years, until I finally let it out. By morning, Brandon was gone. No note, no call, just a cold coffee pot, and his keys missing from the hook. I made breakfast for the first time without second-guessing the sound of the toaster. By 9 in the morning, I had the locksmith on the phone. I told him to make it fast. He arrived that afternoon, a kind man who didn't ask questions as I handed him the old keys. When he left, I stood in the foyer with a new key in my hand. It was the first thing I had owned alone in years. That evening, I moved into the master bedroom, stripped the sheets that smelled of his cologne, and bundled them into trash bags. I opened every window to let the December wind wash through the room. I lit sandalwood candles, the ones he said gave him headaches, and watched the light dance on the walls. The next day, his mail started arriving with red stamps for past due notices. I stacked them neatly on a side table, but didn't forward a single one. Jenny called, her voice bubbling with the news that Brandon's lawyer had called. She told me he had lost 70% of his assets overnight. With the baby on the way, he was going to be cutting a check so big he'd need a payment plan. I smiled, not for the money, but because I could finally sit in my living room without bracing for war. The fallout from the divorce was like snow melting, quiet, but inevitable. Some friends unfollowed me, and some chose sides, but others were bolder. A woman I hadn't spoken to in 2 years messaged me saying she wished she had my strength. A bouquet of peonies arrived from Brandon's assistant, Claire, with a card that just said, "About time." Word had spread at his office, and the man who joked about training wives like interns had lost his audience. Nate stopped laughing in meetings, and Brandon's swagger vanished. I heard through the grapevine that he was leaving work early and ignoring deadlines, looking haunted. I started buying lavender soap again and painted the nursery a soft sage green, a color Brandon had once called pointless. I hung string lights and placed a stuffed giraffe in the corner. I spent my evenings drinking herbal tea in the sunroom, barefoot and unbothered. One evening, I caught myself humming while folding laundry, something I hadn't done since our second anniversary. I bought new white sheets with gold stars and slept diagonally across the mattress just because I could. I passed Brandon on the street once. He was talking irritably into his phone and didn't even notice me. I just kept walking. Jenny sent me a screenshot showing that Brandon's firm had removed his name from the newsletter. I replied with a thumbs up and went back to watching the wind dance through my curtains. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about the small things, freedom, peace, and the realization that the woman he tried to break was the one who rebuilt everything. The first time I felt the baby kick, I was in the kitchen slicing peaches for a pie. It was a soft flutter, like a wing brushing my inside. I dropped the knife and stood there stunned, tears of joy catching me off guard. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone. That night, I wrote in my journal that this baby would never hear yelling through a door or feel like they were walking on glass. I underlined the promise that they would never confuse fear with love. My world was smaller now, but it was warmer and softer. My cousin Elena moved into the guest room during my second trimester, arriving with lavender muffins and a promise that I wouldn't do this alone. We fell into a rhythm immediately. She worked from the kitchen table in fuzzy socks and never brought up Brandon. That part of the story wasn't worth repeating. Jenny dropped by every few days with groceries and baby name books. We laughed more in those months than I had in years. We didn't talk about court filings or old wounds. We talked about recipes and crib colors. Silence was no longer something I feared. The baby's room took shape slowly as I refinished thrifted furniture, one coat of paint at a time. Elena spent 3 hours trying to assemble a rocking chair before declaring it her villain origin story. We laughed until our faces hurt. One Sunday, I found a box of wedding photos in the closet. I looked at the frozen smiles and the white lace, but I didn't cry. I slid each photo into an envelope and donated the box to a center, walking away feeling lighter than ever. I stopped at a bookstore and bought a new blank journal, titling the first page, "Plans That Are Only Mine." By the time Christmas came around again, the house smelled like cinnamon and pine instead of tension. The dining table was smaller and cozier, filled with real laughter. Beth brought her toddler, who was yelling with pride every time he dropped mashed potatoes. My dad carved the turkey while Elena tried to make vegan gravy. Jenny brought a date, and for the first time, I felt completely full. Next to my sister's son sat a brand new high chair for my daughter. She had his eyes, maybe, but the rest was all mine. Her cheeks were pink, and she babbled as if giving the most important speech in the world. I didn't spend the evening watching the door or checking my tone. I was present for every bite and every story. After dinner, I curled into the armchair by the fire with my daughter asleep on my chest. Her tiny breaths warmed my sweater. Everyone else had gone for a walk, leaving me in a peace that used to feel fictional. I whispered to her that he said I'd be nothing without him. I kissed her forehead and murmured that it turns out I am everything without him. The journey from that hallway with the tray of drinks to this armchair had been long and silent, but every step was worth it. I looked at the new key on the mantel, a symbol of the life I had built from the ashes of a bad bet. Brandon had thought women were predictable, but he failed to realize that resilience isn't a scream. It's the quiet strength of a woman who knows exactly when to stop smiling and start acting. I watched the embers in the fireplace glow, feeling the solid weight of my daughter against my heart. The story didn't end with the divorce papers. It began the moment I decided that I was worth more than a wager. The weeks following that second Christmas felt like the true beginning of my life. The legal battles had finally settled into a rhythmic exchange of documents that no longer had the power to make my heart race. Brandon had tried to fight the 70% split, but the notarized napkin and the subsequent addendums Jenny had crafted were ironclad. Every time his lawyer tried to find a loophole, they were met with a time-stamped digital trail that painted a picture of a man who was fully aware of what he was signing. He was paying for his arrogance in installments, and the financial weight of it had forced him to sell his car and move into a much smaller apartment on the other side of town. I stood in my kitchen, the sun streaming through the windows and catching the dust motes dancing in the air. My daughter, who I named Maya, was in her swing, eyes wide as she tracked the movement of a colorful mobile. I realized then that I hadn't looked at the filing cabinet in months. The journals, the receipts, and the recordings were all moved to a secure digital vault, but the physical copies were gone. I didn't need the evidence anymore because I was living the proof. My life was no longer a series of defensive maneuvers. I was no longer a spy. I was just a mother, a friend, and a woman who liked her coffee strong and her house quiet. Elena had stayed on, her presence in the guest room becoming a permanent fixture of our new family. We sat on the porch one evening, the air starting to hold the first faint hint of spring. She asked me if I ever thought about what would have happened if I hadn't overheard them that night in the hallway. I watched a bird land on the birdhouse I'd put up a few weeks ago. I told her that I think I would have found out eventually, but the hallway gave me the gift of time. It gave me the chance to turn a tragedy into a strategy. Brandon thought he was serving me an ending, but he actually served me a wake-up call. My career, which had been on the back burner while I managed Brandon's ego, was starting to flourish again. I had taken a part-time consulting role that allowed me to work from home, and for the first time, I was getting credit for my ideas. There was no one at the dinner table to tell me I was overspending or that I was lucky to be there. I was the one who decided the budget, the one who fixed the Wi-Fi when it went down, and the one who made the decisions. The sense of autonomy was intoxicating. I found myself walking with my head higher, my shoulders back, no longer trying to take up as little space as possible. One afternoon, I received a letter from Brandon. It wasn't through his lawyer this time. It was a handwritten note, the ink slightly smeared. He wrote that he missed the house and that he was struggling to adjust to his new reality. He asked if we could meet to talk about us and the baby. I read it once, felt a brief flicker of the old nausea, and then I realized it had no power over me. He wasn't asking to see Maya because he cared. He was asking because his life had become uncomfortable, and he wanted to go back to the version of it where I did all the heavy lifting. I didn't reply. I didn't need to explain my silence to him anymore. I took the letter to the fireplace and watched it burn, the edges curling into black ash. The man who had bet on my tears didn't realize that tears can wash away the scales from your eyes. I went back to the living room and picked up Maya, her small body warm and solid against mine. I thought about the woman in the hallway, the one with the tray of drinks and the pulse roaring in her ears. I wished I could tell her that it was going to be okay, that the roar was just the sound of her own strength waking up. But then again, she already knew. She was the one who picked up the pen and signed her way into a brand new world. The evening ended with a phone call from Jenny. She was laughing, telling me about a new restaurant we had to try. We talked for an hour about everything and nothing. As I hung up, I looked around my home. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't a fairy tale, but it was mine. Every candle, every sage green wall, and every gold star on the sheets was a choice I had made for myself. I walked to the window and looked out at the streetlights, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the night that Brandon thought would be my undoing. It was the best gift I had ever been given. The transition into my third trimester felt like the final climb of a long mountain. Brandon's silence after my refusal to meet wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with the legal pressure Jenny was applying to finalize the last of the asset transfers. I spent my mornings in the nursery, touching the soft sage green walls and organizing the tiny clothes that seemed to represent a future I had finally earned. One afternoon, a heavy manila envelope arrived via courier, but it wasn't from a lawyer. It was a collection of printed photos from Nate, Brandon's best friend. There were pictures of Brandon at various bars and restaurants over the past year with M, the woman from the messages. Nate had added a sticky note that simply said, "I'm sorry." I stared at the images, expecting to feel a sharp sting of betrayal, but all I felt was a clinical kind of confirmation. These were the missing pieces of the timeline I had logged in my spiral notebook. I called Jenny immediately, and her voice sharpened into a professional edge the moment I described the photos. She told me this was the final nail in the coffin for any remaining claims Brandon had regarding his fidelity or his character during our marriage. We weren't just looking at a divorce anymore. We were looking at a complete public and financial restructuring of his life. By the end of the week, the news of the photos and the ironclad prenup had leaked through the social circles we once shared. I received a call from Brandon's mother, her voice trembling not with anger, but with a deep, hollow shame. She told me she had seen the documents and the evidence I'd shared at Christmas. She didn't ask for forgiveness for her son. She only asked if she could still be a grandmother to the baby. I sat on the edge of the new bed, looking at the gold stars on the sheets, and told her that the baby deserved a family that valued the truth. I didn't shut the door, but I didn't lower my guard either. The social ladder I had been pushed off was now collapsing beneath Brandon. Reports came back to me that he had been asked to take an indefinite leave of absence from his firm. The man who had bragged about his wife being a dependent hobbyist was now the subject of office gossip and legal scrutiny. I walked through the grocery store later that day, and for the first time, I didn't scan the aisles for his mood or check my watch to see if I was running late for his dinner. I bought a pint of expensive ice cream and a bouquet of flowers for myself. That night, Elena and I sat in the living room with the sandalwood candles burning bright. She was reading a book on infant sleep cycles while I worked on my journal. I wrote about the weight of the photos and the call from his mother. I realized that Brandon's downfall wasn't my doing. It was the natural consequence of the life he had chosen to lead behind my back. I was just the one who refused to be the cushion for his fall. As I closed the leather cover of the journal, I felt a sharp, distinct pressure against my ribs. Maya was kicking again, a rhythmic reminder that the world was moving forward, whether Brandon was ready or not. The air in April was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and new growth as my due date approached. The legal process had moved from a battle into a cleanup operation. Brandon had officially signed over the house and the majority of the investment accounts, his lawyer finally advising him that a trial would only lead to more public embarrassment. I spent my days moving slowly, my body heavy, but my mind lighter than it had been in a decade. Jenny had sent over the final decree, and all it needed was a judge's signature to turn my temporary peace into a permanent reality. One evening, a car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the window as Brandon stepped out. He looked thinner, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, and the arrogance that once defined his walk was gone. He didn't have a key anymore, so we stood on the porch and knocked. I didn't open the door. I opened the small side window instead, the security latch firmly in place. He didn't shout or demand to come in. He just asked if he could see the nursery. He said he had heard it was green. I looked at the man who had bet on my tears and felt a strange sense of distance. He was a stranger who happened to share my history. I told him that the nursery was a private space for a new life, and he wasn't part of that foundation. He looked down at his shoes, the same ones he used to polish every Sunday, while telling me I was lucky he stayed. He asked if there was any way to fix the settlement, saying he was struggling to pay his rent. I told him the settlement was based on the document he signed and the evidence he created. I closed the window and watched him walk back to his car in the fading light. The next morning, the locksmith came back to check the bolts on the back door. He was the same man with kind eyes, and he commented on how much the garden had improved. I realized I had been planting things I actually liked, wildflowers and herbs, instead of the rigid, formal hedges Brandon preferred. My sister Beth arrived later with a carload of baby gear, her toddler running circles around the kitchen island. We sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes and wrapping paper, and she told me she had seen Nate at a coffee shop. Apparently, Brandon had been trying to borrow money from anyone who would listen. We didn't dwell on him for long. The conversation shifted to names and the upcoming shower. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the women in my life who had formed a perimeter around me when I was too weak to stand. Jenny, Beth, Elena, they were the ones who had held the line. As the sun set, I felt the first real contraction, a tightening that felt like the start of a long-awaited storm. I didn't panic. I just reached for my bag and called Elena, knowing that the woman who had started this journey was ready to finish it. The hospital room was filled with the soft hum of monitors and the quiet chatter of the nurses. Labor was a different kind of war, one where the pain had a purpose and the end result was life instead of loss. Beth and Elena took turns holding my hand, reminding me to breathe through the waves. I thought about the night in the hallway, the tray of drinks, and the roar in my ears. That roar was gone, replaced by a steady, focused determination. When the doctor finally told me it was time, I didn't feel like a victim or a predictable woman. I felt like a force of nature. Maya arrived in a burst of noise and light, a tiny screaming miracle that changed the air in the room. The moment they placed her on my chest, the last of the tension from the past year simply evaporated. She was warm, damp, and perfectly hers. I looked at her tiny fingers and realized that she would grow up in a house where the walls didn't echo with hidden cruelty. She would never have to learn the art of the practiced smile or the weight of a husband's contempt. She was the first person in my life who was truly entirely mine. Jenny arrived an hour later with a bottle of sparkling cider and a folder. She waited until the nurses had finished their checks before sliding a single sheet of paper onto the tray table. It was the final divorce decree, signed by the judge and stamped with the seal of the court. I was officially a single woman, and I was holding my future in my arms. Brandon had tried to call the hospital, but Jenny had already informed the staff that he was not to be admitted. The boundary was set, and for the first time, it was enforced by more than just my own will. The ride home from the hospital was slow and cautious. Elena drove while I sat in the back, watching Maya sleep in her car seat. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, brighter somehow, even in the afternoon shade. The wildflowers I'd planted were starting to bloom, splashes of color against the sage-green exterior. I walked through the front door with the new key and felt a wave of peace that was so physical it made my eyes water. This was the home I had reclaimed, the one where the locks worked and the air was clear. That evening, I sat in the rocking chair that had caused so much laughter during its assembly. Maya was tucked into a soft blanket, her breath steady and small. I looked at the mantel where the peonies were still standing, a reminder of the unexpected allies I had found. I realized that Brandon had been right about one thing. I was predictable. I was predictably strong, predictably resilient, and predictably capable of building a life out of the ruins he had left behind. I didn't need to look at the journal anymore. The story was over, and the new one was just beginning. The first year of Maya's life was a blur of milestones and soft, quiet mornings. The house had transformed into a place of light, filled with the sounds of her babbling and the hum of the record player. Brandon had moved away, his name a fading echo in our social circles. I heard occasionally through Nate that he was working a mid-level job in a different city, the swagger and the whiskey-clinking lifestyle a thing of the past. He sent a card on Maya's first birthday, but I didn't show it to her. She was too busy chasing the toddler version of Beth's son across the grass. I stood in the kitchen on a warm Tuesday afternoon, slicing peaches for a pie, just like the day I first felt her kick. Elena was at the table, her laptop open, but she was mostly focused on trying to teach Maya how to use a spoon. We had become a family of choice, a unit built on trust and mutual respect, rather than the fragile ego of a man who needed to feel superior. The sage green walls were now covered in framed photos of our adventures, the park, the zoo, and the quiet moments in between. My consulting business had grown enough that I was thinking about hiring an assistant. I was no longer the woman who checked her tone or prayed her sentences didn't offend. I was the woman who made the calls, signed the contracts, and set the terms. I looked at the silver pen on the counter, the one I had used to sign the divorce papers at that final Christmas dinner. It was a tool, a reminder that words have power and that signing your name can be an act of liberation. That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of herbal tea. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the lawn. I thought back to the woman in the hallway, her pulse roaring in her ears. I felt a deep, abiding compassion for her. She had been so afraid, yet she had been so brave. She had taken the knife he gave her and used it to cut the ties that were strangling her. She had turned a betrayal into a blueprint for a better life. Maya came crawling out to the porch, her hair messy and her eyes bright. She pulled herself up using my knees and looked at me with a pure, uncomplicated love. I picked her up and held her close, the scent of lavender soap and baby lotion filling my senses. I realized that Brandon's bet was the greatest failure of his life, but it was the greatest victory of mine. He thought I would cry and crumble, but instead, I had bloomed. I walked back inside and locked the door. The click of the bolt a final, satisfying punctuation mark. The house was warm, the candles were lit, and the air was peaceful. I whispered to Maya as I carried her upstairs that we were everything without him. We were a whole world, a complete story, and a future that belonged to no one but ourselves. As I tucked her in beneath the gold stars, I knew that the peace wasn't just a moment. It was our new permanent address. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.